I speak to you tonight not as a symbol, not as a uniform, and not as a headline. I speak as a man who has carried silence for a long time, and who now understands that silence, when held too long, can become a form of betrayal. My name is Ibrahim Traore. I am the president of Burkina Faso. But before I was any of that, I was simply a son of this land, a man searching for meaning, discipline, and moral direction in a world that rarely offers any of them freely. As my responsibilities grew heavier, so did my questions. Power has a way of stripping certainty from even the most disciplined mind. Decisions are rarely clean. Consequences are never fully visible. In those moments, I felt the need for counsel that was not political, not strategic, and not transactional. I needed guidance that came from a place untouched by ambition. That was how I came to know Father Gabriel. He was already old when I met him, living quietly in a small, weathered church not far from where I worked and lived. The building itself seemed forgotten by time. Cracked stone, wooden doors worn smooth by generations of hands, and an interior that smelled faintly of dust, candle wax, and old paper. He asked for nothing. He advertised nothing. He listened. Whenever I faced decisions that weighed on my conscience, I went to him. Sometimes we spoke of faith, sometimes of doubt, often of people. He never told me what to do. He asked questions instead. Questions that stayed with me long after I left the church. Over the years, I came to trust him almost completely. Not because he agreed with me, but because he never tried to own me. I had begun to explore Christianity seriously during that period of my life. Not as a performance, and not as a political gesture. I was searching for structure in my inner life, for a moral anchor strong enough to hold under pressure. Father Gabriel became part of that search. He was steady, restrained, and seemingly transparent. I believed I knew who he was. I was wrong. What I am about to tell you began on a night when rain erased the streets, when time seemed suspended, and when a secret buried for decades finally demanded air. I will tell it plainly, not to accuse, not to instruct, but because truth once revealed to you no longer belongs to you alone. The rain that night was not gentle. It did not fall as rain usually does, in patient rhythms that allow thought to wander. It struck the city with force, as if the sky itself had lost restraint. The streets emptied early. Even the guards moved with urgency, shoulders hunched, boots splashing through water that gathered faster than it could escape. It was close to 11 at night when the message reached me. Not a formal call, not a coded alert, a simple, urgent sentence, delivered by someone whose voice was already shaking before he spoke. Father Gabriel is dying. He is asking for you. Now. There was no hesitation, but there was a pause. A pause long enough for instinct to collide with responsibility. Leaders are trained to measure risk, to delay emotion, to ask questions first. But this was not a political moment. This was human. I took my coat and left immediately. The drive felt longer than it should have. The rain distorted the lights, bending them into pale streaks across the windshield. My thoughts moved faster than the car. I told myself that age eventually claims everyone, that illness waits patiently for its moment. Still, something in my chest tightened with every turn of the road. The church appeared suddenly through the rain, darker than the night around it. No lights burned in the windows, no movement greeted me. It looked abandoned, like a place the world had quietly agreed to forget. I stepped out into the rain and felt it soak through my clothes before I reached the door. Inside, the air was cold. Candles flickered weakly along the walls, their flames struggling against drafts that whispered through unseen cracks. A young assistant led me without speaking. His face was pale, his eyes avoiding mine. That silence told me more than words could have. Father Gabriel's private room was small, too small for a man who had carried so many confessions. A narrow bed stood against the wall. A wooden cross hung above it, worn smooth by time. He lay there, thinner than I remembered, his chest rising and falling unevenly, each breath sounding like a negotiation. For a moment I stood frozen in the doorway. I had seen death before. Soldiers, civilians, friends. Death never announces itself politely. But seeing it approach someone you trust feels different. It strips away all titles. I was not a president in that room. I was a man about to lose an anchor. When he saw me, something changed. His eyes, dull moments earlier, sharpened with sudden awareness. Not relief, not comfort, urgency. He motioned for me to come closer. His hand reached out, trembling but determined. I took it. His grip was stronger than I expected, the strength of someone who had been waiting, not drifting. He pulled me down until my ear was close to his mouth, His breath was warm, shallow, irregular. He spoke not in sentences but fragments, as if time itself were pressing against him. "Close the door." I looked back. The assistant had already disappeared. The door was closed, but I checked it anyway. The click of the lock sounded louder than it should have. When I turned back, Father Gabriel's eyes were fixed on mine. "Walls, listen," he whispered. That was the first crack in the image I carried of him. Fear was not new to me, but fear in him was. This was not the fear of death. It was the fear of exposure. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His hand tightened again, nails pressing into my skin. His voice dropped lower, strained, as if the words themselves resisted being spoken. "What I am about to tell you will undo everything you think you know about me." In that instant, I understood that this night was not about farewell. It was about revelation. I remember thinking how strange it was that a room so small could suddenly feel immense, how silence could become heavy, how trust, once solid, could turn fragile in a single breath. I did not yet know the content of the truth he carried, but I felt its weight before it was named. I told him to rest. I told him to save his strength. He shook his head slowly. "If I do not speak now, it will continue after me." That sentence still follows me. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, deep and unresolved. Inside that room, a man who had guided my conscience for years prepared to dismantle the foundation of our relationship. I leaned closer, unaware that I was leaning toward a shock that would echo far beyond that night. This was the beginning, not of an ending, but of an unveiling that had waited nearly 2 decades for its moment. And the rain did not stop. Father Gabriel gathered what little strength remained in him, not with calm, but with desperation. His breathing grew harsher, as if every word demanded payment from a body already bankrupt. He pulled me closer, his fingers digging into my wrist, not in pain, but in insistence. He was afraid that even the air between us might steal his words. "Do not interrupt me," he whispered, "not even to forgive me." That request unsettled me more than anything else. Forgiveness is usually asked for after a confession, not before. I nodded anyway. In moments like that, consent becomes instinctive. He closed his eyes for a brief second, long enough for me to think he might have lost consciousness. Then he spoke again, his voice barely surviving the journey from his chest to my ear. "I was not sent here by God." The sentence landed softly, but it did not stay soft. It spread through me slowly, like cold water finding every crack in stone. I waited for clarification, for metaphor, for illness to reveal itself through confusion. None came. When I arrived in this country, nearly 2 decades ago, I arrived with a mission. He paused often now, each pause stretching longer than the last. I could hear the rain, the candles, my own pulse. His eyes opened again, sharper, focused in a way that felt almost cruel. I was placed here, carefully, deliberately. My mind began to resist him. I wanted to explain it away. Old age distorts memory. Fever invents stories. Fear exaggerates guilt. But his tone did not belong to imagination. It belonged to confession. He told me he had not chosen the priesthood first. He had been chosen for access, for patience, for proximity. Faith was not the cover. Faith was the tool. I did not speak. I could not. Something inside me was bracing, instinctively preparing for impact. "I was instructed to be close to power," he continued, "to listen more than I spoke, to remember everything, presidents, ministers, generals, anyone who believed confession meant safety." His grip weakened, then tightened again, as if he feared losing me before finishing. His voice dropped further. "And then you came." He said my name with effort, not reverence, not affection, recognition. "You were not part of the plan, not at first, but when you began to rise, the instructions changed." My thoughts fractured. Images of past conversations flashed through my mind. Quiet afternoons, moral discussions, advice given without demand. I re-examined every memory in an instant, searching for signs I had missed. I found none. That absence disturbed me most of all. I wanted to stand, to pull away, to deny the room, the night, the words. Instead, I stayed. Leaders are trained to absorb information before reacting. That training saved me from collapsing into emotion. He told me how reports were written, how information traveled, how carefully phrased observations could shape policy far beyond our borders, how silence itself could be a message. "I never lied to you directly," he said, and his voice cracked. That was how I justified it. The room felt smaller now, as if truth consumed space. I realized that what I was hearing was not a single betrayal, but a structure of betrayal built patiently over time. I asked him why he was telling me now. He laughed weakly, a sound without humor. Because they will replace me. He explained that his death would not end the operation. Another would come, younger, more careful, already trained. The church would remain, the access would remain, the listening would continue as if nothing had happened. Everything had been prepared. Even his own exit. The cruelty of that planning stunned me. To design infiltration that survives the infiltrator is to understand nations not as living communities, but as systems to be harvested. His eyes filled with tears then. Not sudden, not dramatic. Slow, heavy tears that seemed to carry years of weight. I did not expect to change, he said. I thought time would numb me. Instead, it sharpened me. He told me that watching my choices unsettled him. That seeing restraint where aggression was expected confused him. That witnessing how I treated people who could offer nothing in return broke something inside him that training could not repair. I began to see a fracture in the man before me, not between truth and lies, but between duty and conscience. I have lived in contradiction, he said, and I am tired. I felt anger then, not explosive, cold, precise. The anger of realizing that trust had been weaponized against me, against my country, against faith itself. But beneath that anger was something more complicated. A recognition of courage, not the clean courage of heroism, but the ugly courage of confession, the kind that offers no reward. I asked him what he wanted from me. Nothing, he said, only that you know. The rain softened outside, as if listening. His breathing grew shallow again. He squeezed my hand once more, weaker now. I could not carry this into death. Those were his last coherent words. Minutes later, his body gave up what his conscience no longer could hold. He died quietly. No drama, no final absolution, just silence, returning to a room that would never feel the same again. I stayed there longer than protocol would advise, longer than reason allowed. I stared at a man I no longer fully understood, yet somehow understood more clearly than ever before. The church returned to stillness. Candles burned down, the rain slowed, and with his final breath, Father Gabriel left me alone with a truth that refused to stay contained. I walked out into the night carrying a secret that had not yet finished unfolding. I did not sleep that night. Even after I left the church, even after the rain loosened its grip on the city, my mind refused rest. I replayed every word Father Gabriel had spoken, not searching for meaning, but searching for error. Something to disprove him. Something to reduce his confession to delirium. Nothing fit that comfort. By morning, his words had not weakened. They had sharpened. He was not only a priest. He was an asset. Nearly 20 years earlier, he had been placed in this country with intention. Not as a tourist. Not as a missionary in the traditional sense. He was trained, briefed, and embedded. His faith gave him access, but his true role was observation, proximity, patience. Western intelligence does not always arrive with soldiers or diplomats. Sometimes it arrives with silence, with prayer, with listening ears in rooms where defenses are lowered. He told me that previous presidents had confided in him, some openly, some unknowingly. In moments of moral exhaustion, men speak more freely to priests than to advisors. Confession disarms caution. Faith dissolves suspicion. And he recorded everything. Not with devices, not with notes taken in front of anyone, but with memory, discipline, and later, with reports crafted carefully enough to look harmless. Context, disguised as reflection. Moral concern shaped into strategic insight. When he spoke of it, his voice trembled, not with fear of discovery, but with the accumulated weight of having lived two lives in one body. I began to understand why he had always been careful with words, why he asked questions instead of giving answers, why he never appeared surprised. He had been listening long before he met me. What struck me most was not the scale of the operation, but its patience. 2 decades is not a short-term plan. It is generational thinking. It is the kind of planning that assumes nations will always be predictable, and people will always behave according to incentive and pressure. He believed that too. Until he didn't. He told me that when my name first appeared in briefings, it was only as a possibility. A young officer, disciplined, quiet, nothing remarkable. But as time passed, the interest grew. Not because I was powerful, but because I was difficult to read. Uncertainty makes institutions uncomfortable. When I began to rise, the instructions shifted. He was told to be closer, to listen more carefully, to understand not only my decisions, but my motivations, to determine whether I could be influenced, redirected, or neutralized. He never tried to push me directly. That was not his role. Influence works best when it feels like guidance, not pressure. He let me believe the path was mine alone. And in many ways, it was. That is what complicated everything. He told me he had expected to feel nothing. That training had prepared him to see leaders as patterns, not people. But over time, he saw inconsistencies that troubled him, choices that did not align with the models he had been taught. He saw restraint where escalation was predicted. He saw loyalty to ordinary people where personal advantage was available. He saw hesitation not as weakness, but as conscience. That did not fit the reports he was expected to send. So he learned to split himself. One part observed, the other judged. And slowly, the judgment grew heavier than the mission. He said something that still echoes in me. I realized I was studying a man, not managing a threat. That realization did not absolve him. It haunted him. The most terrifying part of his confession was not what he had done, but what would happen after his death. He was clear about this. His role was not unique. It was renewable. Another priest would arrive. The community would accept him. The church would remain trusted. The work would continue, as if nothing had ever been disrupted. Infiltration survives best when it looks like continuity. He knew that if he died silently, the cycle would repeat. That his silence would be participation even in death. That realization was what finally broke him. I felt something fracture inside me as he spoke. Not my belief in faith, but my belief in insulation. I had assumed that sincerity created safety, that morality discouraged manipulation. I was wrong. What he revealed forced me to confront a brutal truth. Power attracts observation. Integrity does not protect you from being studied. It often makes you more interesting. I did not know yet what I would do with this knowledge. I only knew that it had changed the way I would see silence forever. That night, Father Gabriel exposed not only himself, but a system that thrives on patience, humility, and trust. He showed me how easily goodness can be used as a doorway. And he did it knowing there would be no reward. When he finished speaking, his face relaxed in a way I had never seen before, as if confession, even late, had finally released him. The secret was no longer his alone, and it was only the beginning. In the days that followed his death, I moved through my responsibilities as if through water. Everything felt heavier. Every word spoken to me carried a second meaning. Every silence felt deliberate. I had not told anyone what Father Gabriel revealed. Not my advisors, not my security, not my closest companions. Some truths are too volatile to release without preparation. I kept asking myself whether his confession had come too late to matter. Father Gabriel had been precise about this part. The plan did not end with him. It was designed to outlive him. He told me that replacement was not an improvisation, but a procedure. Files already prepared, backgrounds already constructed, a successor ready to step into the same church, the same routines, the same listening posture. Continuity creates invisibility. The church would announce the arrival of a new priest. The community would mourn briefly, then adjust. Candles would be lit. Confessions would resume. And information would continue to flow outward, quietly, patiently, without urgency. I understood then that what unsettled him most was not his own betrayal, but the elegance of the system he had served. A system that required no force, no threats, no visible coercion, only time. He told me that the original plan assumed obedience until death, silence as the final act of loyalty. But something in him resisted that ending. Not heroism, exhaustion. He had spent years telling himself that influence was abstract, that reports were harmless, that consequences belonged to others. But as he aged, abstraction collapsed. Faces replaced data. Decisions stopped being theoretical. He said he began to imagine history reading his work not as analysis, but as complicity. That was when he decided to break the pattern. What struck me deeply was that he did not frame his confession as redemption. He did not ask me to see him as a victim. He did not accuse the forces that placed him here. He spoke only of responsibility, of choosing, finally, to interrupt a process that would otherwise continue smoothly. I realized how rare that kind of interruption is. Systems are built to absorb individuals, not be disrupted by them. For someone inside such a system to refuse the final step requires something stronger than fear. It requires disgust with one's own silence. He knew the consequences, not legal, spiritual. He believed that speaking would cost him peace in whatever came next, and yet he spoke anyway. In the days after his funeral, I returned to the church alone, not to investigate, to observe. I sat where I had always sat. I watched people enter, kneel, pray, trust. Nothing looked different. That was the most disturbing part. Truth does not announce itself. It hides comfortably among routines. I thought about how many decisions I had made, believing I was alone with my conscience, unaware that my doubts, hesitations, and convictions might have been translated into strategic assessments far beyond this land. That realization did not make me paranoid. It made me precise. I began to understand that sovereignty is not only defended with borders and soldiers, it is defended with awareness, with the refusal to confuse trust with blindness. Father Gabriel's greatest fear had not been exposure. It had been continuity. The idea that his silence would allow the machine to proceed unchanged. By speaking, he had broken one link. Not the chain, but a link. And sometimes that is enough to force re-examination. I did not yet know how deep his involvement had been. He had told me only what he could in that final hour. The rest, he said, was documented, preserved, waiting. At the time, I did not understand what he meant. I would soon. The night Father Gabriel died, I believed his words were the end of it. A truth spoken, a conscience relieved, a story sealed by death. I was wrong. Confession, I would learn, has momentum. Once released, it keeps moving. In his final moments, regret did not appear as panic. It arrived as clarity, the kind that strips away excuses and leaves only ownership. When he cried, it was not because he feared punishment. It was because he finally understood himself. He told me that for many years he convinced himself he was neutral, that he was merely observing history, not shaping it. He said neutrality is the most seductive lie power tells those who serve it quietly. It allows a person to believe they are untouched by consequence. But time had undone that lie. He had watched men struggle with decisions that would define millions of lives. He had listened to doubt spoken aloud, believing it was safe. And then he had translated those moments into reports stripped of humanity. He had turned uncertainty into vulnerability, reflection into leverage. That realization broke him slowly. He said there were moments when he almost spoke sooner, moments when he looked at me and nearly confessed everything. But he always stopped, not because he lacked courage, but because he feared that truth, once spoken, cannot be controlled. He feared what it would demand of me. It was only when his body began to fail that he understood something essential. Silence had already demanded everything from him, his peace, his faith, his sense of self. He told me that watching how I treated people unsettled him deeply. Not dramatic gestures, small ones, the way I listened longer than necessary, the way I accepted blame publicly and kept credit private, the way I hesitated before decisions that would bring personal advantage. He said those moments made his reports harder to write, because they did not fit the framework. Power, he had been taught, follows patterns. Ambition leaves fingerprints. Ego announces itself. When those markers fail to appear, systems grow nervous. You made me doubt the work, he said quietly. Not because you were perfect, but because you were inconsistent in ways that felt human. That sentence remains with me. He said he began to feel ashamed during prayer. Not because he was lying to God, but because he was lying to himself. He would ask for forgiveness without fully naming the sin. He would confess without confessing. That hollow ritual became unbearable. When he said, "I have lived in lies," it was not an exaggeration. It was a diagnosis. A man split for so long that unity itself felt foreign. He told me he had accepted long ago that he would die carrying this secret. That confession was never part of the plan. But when death arrived sooner than expected, something shifted. He no longer wanted to be efficient. He wanted to be honest. I asked him if he feared what might happen after he spoke. He nodded. Not for himself, but for me. Truth changes people, he said, and I do not know who you will become after this. That concern moved me more than his guilt. Even in confession, he was aware of consequence beyond himself. When he said, "I saw goodness in you," it was not praise. It was explanation. He needed me to understand why he chose to speak now, and not earlier, and not later. Goodness made silence impossible. That is a heavy burden to place on someone. To be told that another man's conscience depended on your choices. I did not feel honored by it. I felt exposed. He did not ask me to forgive him. He did not ask me to protect his legacy. He did not ask me to act. He only asked that I know. And then, as if that knowledge itself had completed something unfinished, his body gave in. His hand loosened. His breathing stopped. The room returned to stillness. I sat there long after, holding a hand that had guided me for years and betrayed me at the same time. I felt no satisfaction, no closure, only the quiet weight of complexity. Some confessions offer relief. This one offered responsibility. In the days after Father Gabriel's death, I discovered that shock does not arrive all at once. It comes in waves. The first wave is disbelief. The second is anger. The third is something quieter and far more dangerous, doubt. I had been watched. That realization did not scream inside me. It whispered. It followed me into meetings. It sat beside me during moments of silence. It asked questions I did not want to answer. How much had he seen? How much had he understood? How much of me had ever been private? The man I trusted most had been observing me for years. That truth alone would have been enough to harden me, to make me suspicious, to close myself off. But what tore me apart was not the betrayal itself. It was the timing of the truth. He could have stayed silent. He could have died as planned, replaced quietly, his work continuing without interruption. No one would have blamed him. No one would have known. History would have absorbed him without a ripple. But he spoke. And he spoke when speaking cost him everything. That contradiction tore at me. I felt anger toward him, yes, but I also felt something dangerously close to respect, not admiration. Respect for the courage it takes to dismantle your own life's work in its final hour. I found myself replaying our conversations not to uncover deception, but to understand transformation. When did he begin to change? When did the weight of his actions become unbearable? When did conscience overpower obedience? I realized that my shock was not only about being betrayed. It was about being forced to see that even those who harm us can still choose truth. That realization complicates hatred. I asked myself what frightened me more, that I had been observed, or that my actions had changed the observer. The second question unsettled me deeply, because it meant my life had not been neutral. It had carried moral consequence beyond intention. I understood then why his confession felt like a burden placed on my chest. He had handed me not only information but responsibility. Responsibility to decide what truth means when it arrives too late to prevent harm, but early enough to prevent repetition. I could not simply dismiss him as an enemy, nor could I forgive him cleanly. The truth lived in between, where certainty does not survive. That space is uncomfortable. It offers no slogans, no simple judgments, only reflection. I thought about courage. Not the kind displayed on battlefields or podiums, but the kind that appears in final moments, when there is no future left to protect. That courage does not make past actions disappear, but it changes how they end. What tore me most was knowing that his final act had been one of integrity, even if his life had not been. He had chosen truth over loyalty, knowing there would be no applause, no redemption arc, no record of sacrifice, only silence. And me. That realization altered how I understood betrayal. It taught me that the most dangerous lies are not told by enemies, but by systems that reward obedience and punish reflection. Father Gabriel had been a servant of such a system. His final rebellion was to refuse its clean ending. I carried that with me like a fracture in the bone, invisible, but shaping every movement. Shock does not always harden a person. Sometimes it sharpens them. It sharpened me. Father Gabriel died that same night, quietly, without witnesses beyond me and the walls that had heard too much already. No alarm followed his final breath. No dramatic interruption. The world did not pause to acknowledge the passing of a man who had carried two lives inside one body. The church returned to its natural stillness. Candles burned low. Shadows reclaimed the corners. The rain outside softened into a steady whisper, as if the sky itself had finished speaking. I remained there longer than anyone expected, longer than protocol allowed. I sat beside the bed and stared at a face that now belonged fully to truth, stripped of intention, stripped of fear. Death had simplified him in a way life never could. There is a particular silence that follows confession. It is not peace, it is suspension. Like standing between two cliffs, aware that sound will eventually return, but not yet knowing from which direction. I left the church alone. No one asked questions. No one needed explanations. The official narrative was simple. An old priest passed away, a respected man, a life of service. A funeral would be arranged. The community would mourn briefly and then continue. That is how history prefers to move. In the days that followed, I kept the secret entirely to myself, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. Truth revealed too quickly can cause more damage than silence ever did. I needed time to understand what I carried. I attended the funeral like any other mourner. I stood among people who had trusted him, prayed with him, confessed to him. They cried honestly. They remembered him fondly. Their grief was real. Their ignorance was complete. I did not correct them. I watched the coffin lowered into the ground and understood something with unsettling clarity. Secrets do not die with people. They wait, sometimes patiently, sometimes only briefly. The church doors closed again. Life resumed its rhythm. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something unresolved remained. Father Gabriel had told me the truth, but he had not told me everything. He had spoken of documentation, of records, of details preserved somewhere beyond that room. At the time, I believed those words were symbolic, a metaphor for guilt that refuses burial. I did not yet understand how literal he had been. For 3 days after his death, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no signs of disturbance. I began to wonder whether the confession itself had been the final act, whether the rest had died with him. On the third evening, as the sun fell low and shadows lengthened across my office, I was informed that a package had arrived. No sender, no explanation, just a wooden crate, old, unmarked, waiting. In that moment, I understood that silence had only been preparing me. The crate was older than it needed to be. That was the first thing I noticed. Not damaged, not broken, just deliberately old. The wood was darkened by time, edges softened by handling, nails slightly rusted. It had the weight of something that had waited patiently for the right moment to be opened. No name, no seal, no explanation. Whoever delivered it left without asking questions and without offering answers. By the time I reached the room where it stood, the corridor outside was already empty. Silence has a way of announcing importance. I dismissed everyone. When I closed the door, the room felt smaller, as if it understood what was about to be revealed. I did not open the crate immediately. I stood there for a long moment, aware that whatever lay inside would change the meaning of everything Father Gabriel had told me. Truth spoken can still be denied. Truth documented resists that luxury. I lifted the lid. Inside were folders, not many but thick, paper aged but carefully preserved. Each document placed with intention. No chaos, no panic. This was not the work of a dying man scrambling to confess. This was preparation. I began to read. Reports, timelines, names, locations, meetings described with unsettling precision, conversations I remembered reframed, categorized, interpreted, my words stripped of tone and context, reduced to strategic indicators. Doubt translated into vulnerability, conviction analyzed for leverage. There were dates spanning nearly 2 decades. Not all about me, presidents before me, advisors, military officers, religious figures, patterns of influence mapped patiently over time. The architecture of observation laid bare on paper. What struck me was not the intelligence itself. It was the language, calm, clinical, detached, as if human lives were weather patterns to be tracked rather than choices to be respected. I saw how faith had been used not as belief, but as access, how trust became infrastructure, how listening replaced intrusion. Then I found copies of what he had sent outward. The reports were addressed to entities far beyond this country. They spoke of stability, of risk, of opportunity. They framed our nation not as a people, but as a variable. I did not feel anger in that moment. I felt clarity. Father Gabriel had not exaggerated. He had minimized. What he confessed verbally was only the surface. The documents revealed scale, depth, intentionality. This had never been improvisation. It had been design. At the bottom of the crate, beneath the folders, lay a single envelope, thicker than the rest. Handwritten address, my name, his handwriting unmistakable. I hesitated before opening it. Letters are different from reports. Reports hide behind purpose. Letters expose motive. I unfolded the paper slowly. He wrote without ornament. No poetry, no excuses. He said he was sorry. Not for being discovered, but for staying silent for so long. He wrote that his entire adult life had been shaped by deception, and that deception, once normalized, becomes easier than honesty. He admitted that the documents were his final act of responsibility, that he had prepared them knowing they might never be opened, that if I chose to destroy them, he would accept that choice. But he could not die knowing the truth remained incomplete. The final lines were written with a steadiness that surprised me. He wrote that he had seen integrity when he did not expect it. That integrity frightened him more than resistance ever could. That was why he chose to speak. Then he wrote something I did not expect. He said that telling me the truth was the only moment in his life that felt entirely his own. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I closed the crate. That night I did not make decisions. I did not issue orders. I did not act. I understood that action without understanding would repeat the same mistake in a different direction. The secret had not been buried. It had been delivered, and now it belonged to me. I have lived long enough to know that truth does not arrive to make us comfortable. It arrives to make us responsible. What Father Gabriel left behind was not only evidence of deception, but a mirror held up to power itself. A mirror that asks a simple question: what do we do when we learn that trust has been used against us, yet conscience still survives within the betrayal? I did not speak immediately after opening that crate. I did not rush to expose, accuse, or dramatize. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be an act of discipline rather than fear. I needed to understand not only what had been done to us, but what kind of people we would become in response. Revenge would have been easy. Public outrage would have been welcomed by many. But outrage burns quickly and leaves little behind. I was not interested in noise. I was interested in immunity. Not immunity from observation, because that is impossible in the modern world, but immunity from manipulation. What I learned from this experience is that domination rarely begins with force. It begins with familiarity, with kindness that asks nothing, with listening that records everything, with patience so refined that it feels like care. That is not a lesson for Burkina Faso alone. It is a lesson for any nation, any community, any individual who believes that morality alone protects them from exploitation. Goodness is not weakness, but innocence can be. I do not share this story to ask for sympathy. I share it because silence would make me complicit in the same pattern that nearly repeated itself after Father Gabriel's death. His greatest fear was continuity without awareness. I will not allow that. At the same time, I refuse to reduce him to a villain. History is not improved by simplification. He lived in deception, yes, but he died choosing truth when silence would have been safer. That choice matters. It does not erase harm, but it interrupts it. If there is one message I want to leave you with, it is this. Systems fall apart when individuals refuse to complete them, even late, even imperfectly. I still believe in faith, but I believe now that faith without discernment becomes vulnerability. I still believe in counsel, but I believe counsel must never replace accountability. And I still believe in leadership. But leadership that refuses to listen to uncomfortable truth eventually collapses under its own certainty. To those watching from far away, especially those who have lived long enough to see promises broken and ideals repackaged, I ask only this: do not surrender your judgment to familiarity. Question even what feels safe, especially what feels safe. I wish no harm upon any nation. I wish no downfall upon any people. I wish clarity for Africa, for the world, for every place where quiet manipulation still hides behind polite language and patient smiles. I hope for a future where young leaders do not mistake access for friendship, and where elders do not mistake silence for wisdom. I hope for a world where courage is not measured only by how loudly one speaks, but by whether one speaks at all when it matters most. If this story has unsettled you, let it. Discomfort is often the beginning of awareness, and awareness, when shared, becomes protection. If you find yourself reflecting, questioning, or remembering moments from your own life where truth waited too long to be spoken, know this: it is never too late to interrupt a pattern. Silence is powerful, but truth, even. I am not asking you to agree with me. I am asking you to listen carefully, think slowly, and decide honestly what kind of world you want to help shape in whatever time remains to you. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. What I have told you here is true. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. These words are spoken without exaggeration and without fear. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. I stand by every truth I have shared with you. If this story resonates with you, if it raises questions worth carrying forward, stay with this conversation. Speak in the comments. Share your thoughts. And if you wish to hear more stories that are told without shouting, without propaganda, and without disguise, you are welcome to return. Some truths take time to unfold. Thank you for listening.